Hey folks, if you're looking for a challenge, today's title is apt to be up your alley, since I'll be talking about the review copy I received of Lateralis Heavy Industries' OTXO. Genre-wise, it's a top-down shooter that leans closer to Rogue than Roguelite, though we'll get into that. For now, it's time to ask the big question. Was this game's gratuitous gunplay gratifying to the point I wolfed through it, or did it bask in mediocrity? I'm your host Arlian. Let's find out together. All it took was a chance encounter on the subway. A stranger dropped a mask as they stepped off the car, and when your fingers brushed against it, there was a compulsion to put it on. In that moment, the world turned white, and your wife faded from sight. Oblivion claimed you, only to spit you up upon unfamiliar shores, a piece of driftwood destined for violence, because your only way out is forward, by venturing to heart of the great mansion which rests ahead, and through the army of gun-toting madmen whose sole purpose is to bury you. Admittedly, that's a bit more poetic than how the game lays out its premise, but OTXO doesn't waste a lot of time before it throws you into the thick of things, being more concerned with the journey than its beginning or end. Still, while it's certainly an action-oriented experience, that's not to say there aren't narrative elements to pursue. For instance, you can take a break from your failed rampages to wander along the beachfront and have a chat with the few sane denizens which reside on the island. While there isn't a heap of dialogue to whittle through, they do provide a few more details about the mansion and themselves, which helps to provide a bit of flavor to the world you're in. And that's not your only avenue either. Occasionally you'll stumble across a lost room in the mansion, curious chambers which seem out of place within its endless corridors, such as a convenience store, a school gymnasium, or even an entire island and lighthouse. While this provides a neat bit of storytelling in and of itself, given it highlights the manse's unreality, they also have a more straightforward narrative device in the form of scattered journals. While the journal themselves are random, odds are you'll have plenty of opportunities to read their contents, earning yourself an idea of how the manse came to be and the path walked by your predecessors. All in all, it's pretty neat, providing something for those who are invested in finding out more about the setting, but also able to be set aside for the folks who are just here to commit violence, which OTXO supplies in spades. But then, that should be expected given that it's a combat-intensive top-down shooter, and yet there's a certain elegance to the whole ordeal because of the nuance buried beneath the body count. Let's start with the more obvious bits. While this is a shooter, it's not the sort where you can mindlessly run and gun due to a few factors. For one, you can only hold one gun at a time, every weapon has limited ammo, and it's treated a bit more realistically than you'd expect. Specifically, most weapons work off clips, which means that when you reload, you'll be throwing away the ammo you've left unused. And you only get one spare clip per gun by default. While this can get awkward in a prolonged firefight, it also does a decent job of teaching you to improvise, specifically by throwing your spent weapon into a mook's face to kill them and then scooping up the first weapon you can get your hands on in order to continue the fight. Given that there is a pretty hefty library of weapons, this haphazard approach to arming yourself can make for some fairly compelling combat encounters, as you're forced to adapt on the fly. That said, I swear by shotguns, since a fair number of them are shell-loaded, which gives you a surprising degree of leeway. That and ambushing people with them is just fun. But yeah, while this largely covers the offense side of things, there are some immutable elements of your kit I've yet to cover. First off, you have a dodge, and it is immensely useful for staying alive, as while you won't die instantly from being shot, the overall lethality of enemies ramps up rapidly as you delve into the mansion, for a fair number of reasons. You can also use the dodge to vault over objects like tables, letting you get away from an enemy or close the gap between you and them. The iframes that both of these options provide are invaluable, and yet even those pale compared to your focus, which is to say, you have bullet time. While it doesn't last overly long, the ability to see incoming bullets and weave between the pellets of a shotgun blast is incredible. It also goes a long way towards helping you survive if you are an idiot and threw your gun away while nothing's nearby. Because while you can kick people to death, getting close to a goon that is kiting you as they fire on you with a shotgun can be a bit tricky. Though, I shouldn't speak overly ill of kicks because, well, they're silent. See, another interesting element of OTXO is the fact that you can engage in a bit of stealth. If you can get close to an enemy and put them down with a kick or silenced weapon, you can avoid triggering an onslaught of aggroed enemies. Admittedly, that can be a bit hard at times, given that the protagonist needs to either shoot or kick down doors, since he's unable to use doorknobs like a civilized person. And the alternative actually is fairly viable too. What I mean here is less a matter of recklessness and more a matter of, if an enemy sees or hears you, they'll rush towards the location you were last detected in, which is great if you want to lure people into a choke point and wait for their guard to drop, or cluster up a few nerds and then throw a grenade their way. All in all, you have a surprising amount of options at your disposal, and you'll need to make use of them because OTXO is hard. In fact, now's about as good a time as any to get into the rogue elements of the game, so let's talk stages. All in all, you'll need to go through 8 distinct areas in OTXO, each of which are composed of several smaller rooms and culminate in a boss fight. Area-wise, everyone starts in the Infinite Foyer, which is essentially a warm-up area, but past that, the specific order of things changes up to some degree, though harder areas are still reserved for the tail end, and the final stage is always the same. Nonetheless, the difference in order can actually make a fairly large impact. For instance, the Untold Bathhouse doesn't seem like a large departure from the initial area until you get closer to the water and your visibility fogs up. What's more, it serves to introduce lizard enemies who will happily charge at your face and shred your health. On the other hand, you might find yourself wandering into the Primordial Conservatory instead, which provides spacious levels and a whole lot of windows enemies can see you through, which is then further compounded by the assortment of snipers it introduces. But then there's the Bottomless Cellar. See, this is a late game region which is steeped in darkness, to the point that your visibility is severely hindered save for a narrow cone. While this is bad enough in and of itself, what makes it especially harrowing is its tight maze of corridors and the introduction of suicide bombers. Now, you might be asking, what does the order matter in all of this? Well, once you've gone through an area, it then adds its distinct enemies to the ones which follow, which can make for a rather nasty problem if you have to navigate cloaking enemies in the aforementioned cellars. Admittedly, you don't actually get a choice in what order the regions show up in, which means the specifics of your journey are largely arbitrary, especially when you consider that each region past the first also adds randomized enemy modifiers. Yeah, you can get some real winners, like the fast modifier when you reach the suicide bombers, or perceptive when you reach the turret stage, and armored, which just makes everything tanky. And they just stack up with every region, turning the final area into an absolute nightmare of lethal enemies. It's not easy, to the point that getting to the bosses was often more of a problem than actually dealing with them. Mostly. Exceptions may apply, especially when you first encounter them, as not only do they have some rather nasty tricks up their sleeve, their patterns also change up once they get low on health, which took me by surprise more than a few times. Admittedly, each region has a fixed boss, so you will gradually acclimatize to their bag of tricks, and well, given you get infinite ammo during a boss fight, there's half-decent odds you'll be able to snag a weapon you're familiar with. And speaking of weapons, the way that your arsenal is handled in OTXO is legitimately fascinating. See, once you've keeled over and washed back up on the beach, you'll be apt to notice a brand new character, a nun belonging to the Church of Guns. What makes this character fascinating is that she's able to carefully curate the sort of weapons you'll encounter during the course of your run. While this is a good way to get rid of weapons you really don't like to use, this has a rather notable side effect if you pause 2 seconds to think about it, since you get all your weapons from the cold dead fingers of your enemies. So yes, things can get pretty harrowing if you focus on high power weapons like shotguns or nastier assault weapons. Not that it stopped me. Because yes, a finely tailored arsenal does heighten the odds a group of mooks will mow you down, but it also means you'll be able to acquire more money, because there's run-specific currency to fuss over. Each enemy is worth a certain amount of money that scales up the deeper into the mansion you go. That said, the real moneymaker is the combo counter. Whenever you messily splatter a mook, your combo counter increases, multiplying the value of your kills. And if you get a high-powered weapon, it's entirely possible to mow down an entire floor in a single combo if you move quickly enough and make good use of weapon swapping. And the reward? Well, it's several-fold. First off, there's the drinks. In the starting room, and every few rooms afterwards, you'll wind up in a bar. Not that one, but no. This bar is distinct in that it offers you 3 different drinks from a fairly broad pool, which essentially serve as your perks for the run. While there are some that are clearly beneficial, such as granting you extra health or damage resistance, others are more complex, such as increasing your damage in exchange for making your guns extremely loud so they'll alert everyone, or being able to dual-wield one-handed weapons in exchange for being unable to vault. These ones all tend to add a bit more complexity to what you're doing, or just utter chaos, such as this mess right here. Getting all the drinks necessary for this takes a bit of doing, but frankly, as long as you have the money, stacking up perks in order to create builds like that is entirely viable, which is further facilitated by your ability to restock the bar, re-rolling your options in the instance that every available option sucks, or you've bought out the ones you want and still have cash to burn. That said, there are other uses for your money, which have more overarching implications for your time in OSHO. First off, while there is a fairly robust assortment of drinks to choose from by default, you can choose to forego immediate gratification and instead toss money at the lady in the bar. She's fairly notable because she allows you to introduce new drink options to the existing pool. While this can be fairly expensive, you don't need to dump in the entire cost all at once. What's more, she does let you try out the drink when you unlock it, which is pretty nice, and a fair bit more predictable than your final money sink. So it's a capsule vending machine. Those secret rooms I'd mentioned way earlier in the lore section, each one just has one of these machines benignly sitting there, which requires a fairly paltry amount of cash to give it a turn. What's interesting about these is that they serve as the primary vehicle for unlocking brand new weapons to fiddle around with. If you're lucky. If you're not, you'll be instead rewarded with a collectible figure, which, yeah, those are gag prizes, and this is a gotcha. Though you do unlock a new weapon when you grab everything, still, this was the last thing I finished off for a small handful of reasons. First off, it was a very arbitrary use of my resources, and while I'd occasionally give it a spin, I felt my money was better spent elsewhere. Secondly, I was only really able to get all of them due to a bit of post-game shenanigans. See, once you clear the mansion, you unlock yet another NPC. Specifically, one who offers you certain deals, modifiers which influence the run for better or worse, like your weapon changing after every kill, or a massive wad of cash up front, but no currency past that point. You can see how I finished off the capsule machine now, can't you? Either way, they're pretty neat, since clearing them also adds new weapons to your arsenal, as well as new drinks you can encounter. It's just, I didn't feel all that inclined, given that the actual pool of rooms isn't as large as you'd think. See, all of OSHO's rooms are handcrafted, and while this means that you have a fair number of engaging set pieces to rampage through, it really won't be that long until you've seen them all. Again and again in the case of the earlier ones, given you have to go through every region in one run. Admittedly, it's not as iterative as you might think encounter-wise, due to the arsenal you chose, the order of stages, and the modifiers you've accrued influencing the sort of opposition you'll come across, but it's still a lot. And no, while there is an impossible mode, which ramps up the damage you and enemies take to astronomical levels, I didn't feel all that inclined to tackle it. But what about the visual side of things? Well, if it isn't abundantly clear by this point, OSHO is an incredibly stylized game. Monochromatic, save for the spatters of gore which coat each of the mansion's rooms. Surprising, given that I'd usually reduced each room to a chaos of shattered vases and broken lights by the time I'd finished piling through all of my ammo. Really, my only issue is that it can sometimes be tricky to see where a gun had dropped when enough dead bodies had piled up in a room. Well, short of manually walking over every spot. That said, while the graphics were certainly neat, the real star of the show here is the soundtrack. Just hot damn did it get my blood pumping as I massacred my way through room after room, region after region. Even the steady staccato of gunfire couldn't drown out just how good this game's music is, with some of the tracks like Deborah's boss theme just lingering in my brain for hours and even days after the fact. But what do I have to say about the experience as a whole? Well, while I am generally a fiend for a good story, OTXO is more about the journey, which is to say it boils down to its gameplay element, and that did keep me busy. The actual act of gradually learning the ins and outs of its various weapons, figuring out the quirks intrinsic to the enemy types and regions, and even just the act of learning to smoothly use my small array of moves was a process. I went from needing to play extremely cautiously in order to advance, and with a reliance on the focus mode, to happily bursting through doors in a furious mess of gunfire and slaughtering whole floors in surprisingly stylish rampages and only the occasional bit of focus to mitigate damage or disable a troublesome enemy. Which is to say, it was satisfying, and it itched a certain scratch I hadn't realized was there for some time. And yet, I'll admit that the tail end of the experience did begin to wear me down. The marathon-esque nature of the game could have benefited from a fair bit more variety given how much iterative action it demanded of me. Like, yes, I did get to gradually experiment with more weapons and approaches, but even that could only last so long. All the same, I do think it's a fabulous game, enough so that I can rate it as a very strong example of a hit. It just needed something extra to really stick the landing. Still, if you're a fan of the Hotline Miami series, you shouldn't pass this one over. Though, P.S., don't try to kick bosses to death. I tried, it was a horrible idea. I mean, I guess you could with the shoot bullets when you kick perk, but this was definitely one of the dumber ways I died. Speaking of dumb, it was very hard to fit a pun into this episode's intro, but I did it. Happy hunting! Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early or just support the channel like Greenwich Babby, Andy Noted, and Shrimp Mania. Also, check the merch house for sneak swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.